I also want to say thank you to IAS for the opportunity to participate in this session. That last statement was that community participation and participatory approaches to research is an integral part of the way that I have been attempting to do my work for quite a while. It's something that I think is a continuous learning curve. In this talk, I want to step back a little bit and initially think back about 10 years or so. And I'm sure that most, if not everybody in this room, will remember when the 3x5 campaign first was put forward as a statement of political will that we can bring treatment to the less developed countries or lower income countries, or however we're going to describe the context today, that the idea was to get 3 million people on HIV, on highly active antiretroviral treatment by 2005. And this was at a time when people wondered if that was even worth thinking about as a possibility. So it was a major campaign, a major change in thinking. Now at the same time, and when Pedro just talked about a lot of the issues that evolve around the PrEP trials and now thinking about trying to roll out PrEP and get uptake of it. Well, the same time that the 3x5 campaign was getting off the ground, that's the time when we were first putting forward proposals to do the PrEP trials. And so this was because of a drug that became available, the TDF drug, that had such a really good adverse event profile that for the first time people thought about using an antiretroviral for the prevention of the acquisition of HIV. So we had two parallel trains of thought going at one time around antiretrovirals, both of them innovative and pushing the envelope. And for the PrEP trials, at the time that the earliest PrEP trials were being discussed and planned, they were primarily targeting women. In fact, the first trials were targeting women. And they were women who, many of them were sex workers as well. And so they were a key population as we describe them today. And the controversies that emerged around the PrEP trials really happened at the confluence of those two streams of thought. And that's what I want to talk about today and discuss issues of community engagement and stakeholder engagement as they emerged out of that confluence. And some of what we have learned, focusing a bit on the positive, if you will, but there's still a lot that we need to work on and sort out here. So the controversies that surrounded PrEP had many layers. Those of you who have been around for a decade will remember most of them, I'm sure. We had distrust surrounding the profit motivations of pharmaceutical companies. Remember, the whole 3x5 campaign was about how do we get expensive drugs to people who really need them and are going to die without them. So the issue around the cost of drugs and the motivations of pharmaceutical companies were absolutely critical to conversation at that time. We were also talking about experimental use of an antiretroviral drug in populations that had limited to no access to antiretrovirals for treatment. Again, that 3x5 campaign. There was also concern that there was potential for undue inducement, that people who are at high risk for HIV infection would be recruited into trials, that these are people who are already vulnerable economically and in many, many other ways, and that offering them compensation for being in research would cause undue inducement. They would join even though it might not be in their best interest to join because they were in such need. At the same time, there was also concern that if the compensation for being in research was low, that in fact it would be exploitative on the other side of the equation, that it would be a way of saying this is how little we value the contribution that you're going to make to our science. There were concerns, Pedro brought up some of this, about how are we going to link people to long-term care if they seroconvert, given the context that all of this was happening in. There was also concern that, of course, in trials we discover other healthcare issues, and how are we going to link people to care when their health systems may not have the adequate ability to actually address those other issues as well. And then, of course, the usual issues around adequacy of the informed consent process. And these concerns all focused on exploitation of vulnerable populations in resource-constrained settings. But there was another stream to the controversy that was also important, and that comes back to the points that I was making before. We've had a separation of treatment and prevention research domains dating back to the early to mid-90s, and I know because I have personal memory of all of this. And our research, the research issues and the challenges and a lot of the issues around design are actually quite different between treatment and prevention. And we can get into a lot of that, but I don't have time. And that meant that people who are very knowledgeable about how to do really good prevention research might not know anything about treatment research design and the issues going on there, and vice versa. And that opens up the opportunity for, when we're walking into the same space, if you will, dealing with the same drugs, there's a lot of opportunity for miscommunication. The other thing that's going on around the time of the PrEP trials, and that has only increased over time, is that communication has changed. Instantaneous communication emerged at around the same time that the early PrEP trials were taking place. And so we all were working from a model initially where, you kind of step back and you think and you frame your response and you think about how you're going to walk through a controversy. We don't walk through them anymore. We run at high speed. And so all of that change was happening at that time. So in a lot of ways, the whole history of PrEP is an opportunity to look at the way we have civil engagement in science, or conversely, how we have failed to have effective civil engagement in science. One of the places where this comes through strongly is in this issue of how we define community. When I first started work in this area, everybody kept saying, well, who is the community? Who is the community? Who is the community? And I kept trying to say, I'm not sure that that's actually the key issue. It's actually communities anyway, it's plural. And this has only become more and more true. We have multi-site trials. We have public-private partnerships in the way that trials happen. We have private and nonprofit sponsors and implementers. We have governments, foundations, and corporate funders. Our advocates come together not just around HIV, but around a multitude of issues. And HIV brings them together, but that's not necessarily where they're all starting. And policy varies from the local to the national to the global. And so when we're talking about dealing with our local communities around these issues, we are trying to integrate across all of those different levels simultaneously. So one of the really good things that came out of the controversies, I think I saw Mitchell out there, that AVAC was instrumental in working with UNAIDS to develop is something that we now call good participatory practices. And the initial good participatory practices were developed around HIV. How do we bring communities and researchers together? And eventually we started talking about stakeholders more broadly. The first edition of this came out in 2007. It was revised in 2011. I suspect there'll be another revision probably in a couple of years as well, because the world keeps changing. Why were the guidelines created? Well, to prevent the kind of misunderstanding and miscommunication that we saw come out of the early PrEP trials. And as AVAC and UNAIDS and others who have worked on this issue have pointed out, because what happens with one product in one trial in one region affects all of biomedical HIV prevention stakeholders, and we saw that very clearly. This is a diagram from the GPP guidelines for HIV. And it's one way of thinking about why it's important to not just talk about local community stakeholders, but to think more broadly. We have trial participants who sit within communities. Those communities have their stakeholders. They sit within broader contexts. It might be a state, it might be a region, it might be some other way of thinking about it. And they sit within nations and they sit within the globe. And so when we talk about working with a participant, what we really have to do is you have to think about a participant and the networked relationships they bring with them. Not just who they know, but who they're connected to. And those become the stakeholders. But there's also another way to think about it, which is we can think about the research site as being also centrally located. when it comes to the way we think about engaging stakeholders. We have a research context that creates its own little mini community. We bring people in as participants, we bring them in as researchers as well. This little mini community sits within a larger community context that can be very complex, which sits within broader social, political, and economic contexts as well. And there's a whole range of stakeholders who come together around that local site. So we can talk about individuals, and we can also talk about communities within communities as well. With the participatory approach that came out around these trials, we're now seeing that model extended. We now have GPP for TB clinical trials as well. So the CPTR initiative has a group called the Stakeholder and Community Engagement Work Group, and they began doing a landscape analysis, a mapping of issues related to community engagement in research around TB trials a couple of years ago. And what they found is that, in fact, people were looking for guidance in this area, and so in 2012 they partnered with AVAC and they adapted the GPP approach for the TB trials context. They're not exactly the same, and so the way in which the principles are framed and the way in which the recommended approaches are framed, they're not exactly the same, but there is significant overlap, and there's obviously opportunity to expand and learn in other contexts as well. Some important aspects of the GPP model. Again, I want to stress that we're talking about communities of stakeholders. And that means that we're bringing together local networks and extra-local networks of stakeholders. And that means that, you know, to try to understand all of the issues that may come into play can be a very complex undertaking. It's something that can actually get a little bit out of control if we're not careful. You know, there's a point where you have to say, well, how many people do you have to bring to the table before you can make a decision to go ahead with the research? And it's a legitimate question, but there has to be an open door policy and an opportunity for engagement. That means that there has to be a reasonable amount of time and human effort that's devoted to this. There has to be enough time so that if there are disparate agendas, they can be talked about and negotiated. And equally important, we are talking globally here, and people can work from different principles when they're coming from very different cultures and societies. There has to be an opportunity to understand where those principles might in fact differ, where people step off from, and if there's going to be any tension between principles, how that tension is going to get negotiated and worked out. One of the things that a lot of us have been working on is, well, how then do we create tools and other resources to help people to do effective engagement around the complicated kind of research that we do? Because we don't want to make it overly burdensome. We do want to try to get to a point of efficiency with all of this. We also want to make sure that what we're doing actually has benefits for communities, for stakeholders, and for stakeholders that include researchers, for people who are going to be at risk for HIV in the future, as well as those who are at risk today. So we need tools that help us evaluate and do self-reflection on all of this. One of the things that I've been engaged in at FHI 360 is development of what we call our Stakeholder Engagement Toolkit. We've partnered with AVAC to work on this as well, and this helps to ensure that what we're doing also is in tandem and in support of GPP itself. So, you know, everybody, I think, you know, there's a pretty universal movement to bring together all of the activities and make sure that they're being mutually supportive. We're not looking for competition on these sorts of issues. With the Stakeholder Engagement Toolkit that we've developed, we provide a step-by-step guidance that help people to think through what is involved in stakeholder engagement. People don't actually have to go step by step, and probably very few people do, but it's a way of organizing a complex process and breaking it down. We provide tools to help staff document what they're doing, and documentation becomes important not just because of the good clinical practice dictum that if it's not documented, it didn't happen, but because the best way to help you be reflexive and think about what you're doing is to sit down and actually document what you're doing and share it with other people and evaluate whether what you're doing is working or not. So documentation to help with co-learning and the process learning. So co-learning, dialogue, advocacy, and debate. are all really critical parts of what GPP is about. And I think, as Pedro's talk highlighted very well, it's also really important as a piece that helps us bridge from research to rollout of effective interventions. If the conversations are had while research is going on, then the learning curve happens while research is going on, and it's not something that has to begin fresh after the research has ended. So we build our relationships with stakeholders who are going to be there when the research is over, and that's a really key piece of what we need to learn to do better. So in summary, the key points that I want to just end on here, that when science is not participatory, it's hard to access. When it's not participatory, it becomes subject to misunderstanding and misinterpretation. And it doesn't have to be that you make it hard to access intentionally. If it is hard to access, then you have the opportunity for misunderstanding and misinterpretation. That creates a difficulty with building a foundation for credibility and trust, and science begins to look like it's really a closed community, and that's not what we need. The public will engage with the science it can access. And credibility and trust, when we have the kind of social interaction that we have at this meeting, as well as through many of the emerging social media opportunities that we have, which I think are very exciting for building that global community. And communities are formed and sustained through social interaction. So in other words, this process is one of building community around HIV prevention. And I think that's where we want to end up, is building a successful community to help prevent acquisition of HIV going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this great presentation. I wanted in particular to thank you for recalling these controversies without demonizing them, because it's quite a taboo. And I think that these controversies tell us a lot about that particular historical context, but they were also the space from where these good participatory practices were built upon, so thank you for that. We have some time for a couple of questions.
Hi, thank you, Kathleen, for that presentation. Could you just clarify
could you please introduce yourself, please?
Can you hear me? Sorry. My name's Gillian Fletcher. I'm from the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society. It's a big mouthful. Could you clarify for me, the participatory process, is it intended just as a way of explaining the research to the community so they can get on board, or is it intended to enable the community to actually amend the research to propose different ways of working and even maybe different research questions?
That's a really important question. And what I would do is make a distinction between engagement, which is what we usually hear people talking about, and a participatory process. Engagement is a step that's necessary to get to a participatory approach. If you're not engaged, then you can't have the participatory approach. If it is participatory, that actually means that there is the opportunity for people to come to the table who are stakeholders and to talk about what the priorities are and how to get the work done. And it's a mutual sharing. And that means that all parties listen to each other, and there should be an opportunity in that dialogue for the way research gets designed and implemented to be influenced by those who are usually viewed as the recipients of the research. But in a participatory process, it's much, much more focused on partnership and collaboration amongst stakeholders. Requires time, requires effort, requires dialogue. Not easy. Thank you.
Okay.
The questions posed by the previous, my name is Ann Sultan, I'm with the Jackson Advocate newspaper in the U.S. The questions posed by the previous person are similar to the questions that I have. Let me go to the question I think is most important for our readership. In your stakeholder toolkit, are you providing for the researchers to modify the methodology even after data collection has commenced?
Okay, so in the stakeholder engagement toolkit, it doesn't tell researchers how to do the research. So it doesn't tell them they shouldn't do what you just recommended or just asked about. It doesn't prevent it from happening, and it should facilitate it happening. So the toolkit is more for creating that space where the dialogue and the conversation can happen. And from that, if there is an opportunity and a benefit and a need to change the way the research is designed, then there's an opportunity to have that conversation and that dialogue and discussion around it. So in my mind, it doesn't preclude it at all. And it hopefully would facilitate it. That would be our goal, that if there is a need and an opportunity, that in fact this would be a way for it to be able to happen. Changing a research protocol, I think, as we all know, requires a lot of discussion and debate, no matter who's putting forward the opportunity to change it. It's very hard even for researchers to suggest changing a protocol that's already been approved and in the field, but it happens. So the stakeholder engagement process and a participatory process would allow for that.
We just take one last question, and we'll have some time in the end of the session for further discussion.
Thank you. Carlos Cáceres, Cayetano Heredia University, Lima. Thanks, Kit, for a great talk, a great analysis. I would add a couple of aspects in your list. One is actually that we had a very firm paradigm based on the condom at that time when all this started, and it was very difficult to really so leave it aside. No? So it had a cost. It was a conceptual cost, an emotional cost as well. And the second is the one that is still, in my view, not sufficiently addressed, which is the issue of cost, of trade, of international access and accessibility. I think that is something that we have to hold in parallel ways, because we can't talk about PrEP and rolling it out without addressing that. No? And just one question is related to participation. I remember when all this started in the Andean area, we were very, one of the key challenges in terms of engaging people in a participatory dialogue was that the terms for people were completely new and very difficult to others. So how to describe what the concept of PrEP meant and what the challenges and all what you have described could be sort of understood, accessed by community members so that they could actively and legitimately participate in a discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments, as well as for the question. And with regard to the question, my short answer is always that in over 20 years of doing this work now, that I very rarely see somebody who comes to these issues with a fresh mind, having not been engaged around biomedical HIV prevention research previously, that to really fully understand all of the issues and be able to talk about them fluidly and with all the nuances that are usually required, it's about a year's learning curve. You know, it's like getting a mini degree. And I think we need to respect that. And I find that as true of people with scientific training as of any community member. It's a complicated topic. And we need to respect that people require time to become proficient at it. And that's why I advocate very strongly for bringing people to the table early rather than late. Because if you wait until you're just about done with the research or the research is over, you've got that year-long learning curve ahead of you with all of the stakeholders you now need to bring to the table. Thank you.